What's going on, guys? So today we're going to be doing one of my favorite modifications that I've done to the drop top. We're going to do it to the sedan today. It's one of the mods I get the questions most about and a lot of comments about because a lot of you guys on Instagram and on the channel really like it. And that is the oil cooler. So a lot of people have been asking me how I do the oil cooler on the drop top, and now we're going to do it on the sedan. So today I'm going to be showing you guys basically how I do this and what it takes to set up the cooler like that. So it's going to be a little bit different than my DIYs. There isn't really a cut and dry way to do it. It's sort of measuring and figuring it all out and seeing how it all fits together and making sure everything works, as opposed to here's what you do, you know. So you guys are going to follow me as I do the mod and sort of explain what I'm doing and how I think it all should go together. And at the end it'll be sick. So for parts, we have a blue G Plus oil cooler. This guy was roughly $100 on Amazon. So this is just the general oil cooling kit, and that's really all you need. The only thing E36 specific is the oil cooler cap. So this is a clean injection oil cooler cap. This actually replaces the oil filter housing cap. It reroutes the oil flow through the cooling lines, but this was actually the last cap that I saw that they had. So in the description I will leave a couple links to similar caps to this style. If you guys want this set up, you can pick one. As for lines, these braided stainless came with the G Plus kit. I really wanted some anodized blue lines, but I didn't find any anywhere. So we're just going to rock the stainless. And depending on the cap you run, you might need a new oil filter. So the clean injection cap that I bought has this little metal ring on the bottom of it. So that actually reroutes the oil flow to go through the cap better, I guess. I'm not exactly sure how it all works. That's basically all you need. Just a cap to redirect the oil flow, and then an oil cooler, and then various mounting hardware pieces, all the good stuff to make it all work. So as far as the mounting hardware goes, I got this guy. I want to say either Lowe's or Harbor Freight, like a couple bucks. And I've had this for a while, so I'm basically just going to use these to hold it into place. Also, because we're adding a brand new oil filter, I am going to be changing the oil. I don't want to run the old oil through the brand new filter and through the brand new oil cooler, so we're going to be changing the oil too. So I think my biggest challenge with this for now is going to be running stock intake and the filter cap. I think this little alternator duct is going to have to go. The drop top, I'm running a cold air intake, which is a lot lighter, sounds better, and is actually a lot smaller. So the cooler lines are going to have to run sort of through that section down underneath here. So we'll see if I can retain the factory airbox while doing this mod. I have a light feeling I might have to ditch it, but we'll see. So I'm going to change up the style a little bit with this car as opposed to the convertible. With the convertible, I have the oil cooler dead center. So the cooler is sitting right in the middle of the bumper here. And I think with the sedan, I want it a little bit to the passenger side. I want it to sit sort of over here as opposed to in the middle. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull the intake airbox off. I'm going to put the cooler cap on, run the lines through, and then see how much room I actually have with the cooling lines. Because if the cooling lines don't fit on the other side of the bumper, there's no reason to take the bumper off, install the cooler just to make the lines not fit. So we're basically going to test fit if the lines are long enough for me to set the cooler over there. So to remove the stock airbox, we have two 10mm bolts, one right here, one right there. And then we're going to take a flathead screwdriver and pry these little sections out to pop it off. Now the intake comes back and up. There we go. So this whole section was where the airbox was. So the plan is to have the cooler cap facing this way. I'm going to remove this guy. The lines are going to run down through here. They're going to run through this little hole right here and then out that hole right there. So that little hole is that brake duct. So of course you have to have the brake ducting removed. On this side it's sort of out and loose, but that guy would usually sit about there. So when I bought the car, it didn't actually come with brake ducting on this side, and that side was actually in, but since I hit that tire it sort of popped it loose. So the cooling lines are going to run out and then into the front of the bumper there when we mount the oil cooler. So cool thing about this cap, it has these little side guys here, little taps. And these you can use for turbo feed lines, which is what I'm going to be using my turbo feed line for on the drop top turbo build. Going to be run off the filter housing cap. So the one for the drop top is actually black. So when you're tightening these down, I'm using a crescent wrench. They don't need to be super tight. Put some electrical tape on the inside. That's just to prevent the coating from being scratched. So they should be nice and tight. Oh yeah. Excellent. Because fuck alternator cooling. Okay, so this is where that cooler cap goes. Now, if you have a metal cap like this, it will bolt right up. Some M52s have plastic filter housing caps instead of these metal ones. Now, they thread onto the actual oil filter housing. If you have a plastic cap, this cooling cap setup is not going to work. You're going to need to convert it to a metal filter housing cap like that one. All S52s have the metal filter housing cap. We'll find a thread for you guys who have those plastic housing caps and drop it in the link in the description on how to convert your filter housing to a metal oil filter housing to run a cooler setup like this. Or another setup you can do is buy a Euro oil filter housing and then run that. And with that setup, you don't even need to run a cooler cap like this. It has little plugs on the side of the filter housing that you can just tap into for oil feed. And this guy is a 13 millimeter. So I'm taking the old filter out. I'm putting the new seal on the new filter cap. I'm going to throw that on right now. And there is no filter in right now, but that's okay because this is basically a dry test fit. Not so much for the cap, but for how we're going to run the lines. So we got the cap on, so I'm going to run the lines up through the bumper up to here to see how much line we have, to see if I can actually run it to the other side over there. So for the lines, we have a longer line and a shorter line that came with this kit. So obviously the longer line is going to run to the farther outside portion of the cooler. But as for which way it goes, I don't really think it matters which line bolts up to which part of the filter cap. It run down through the cooler and then back up into the filter housing, but I don't think it matters if it runs this way or if it runs this way. So these curved edges are the ones that are going to be running to the cooler. These guys are going to be running to the cap. I'm going to feed this bottom line through the brake ducting hole. Stick my hand down there, grab the end of it, pull it up through. Thing with the shorter line. And I'm going to just screw these guys on hand for now. So that looks pretty good already. We do have some room to play with those lines. So my concern at first was that these lines weren't going to be long enough to have a cooler set up on this side of the bumper, but they are. So I thought I was going to have to run them in the middle, but I got enough slack. So we got it test fitted, everything's going to work out as planned. So now we have to pull the front bumper off to mount the cooler. So to remove the front bumper, the first step is to get the car up and get the front wheels off. There are a couple screws on the inner fender liner that you have to remove to get the bumper off. And this guy right here, there should be one right there. I'm not seeing one. I might have to do it a little bit differently because I do have this underplate right here. In general, yep, there's one right there. In general, the screws will be on the side of the bumper, right over here, and then there should be one underneath on the bottom there. And once you got all the internal hardware off on the inside, the fender liner can be sort of popped out from the bumper. So it's not hanging inside the section of the bumper. From here, we're going to work this trim piece off and that trim piece off. I have a flathead screwdriver here, and we're just going to work in between them and pop them up like that. And then this bolt and that bolt, and then there are two on that adjacent side that need to come off, and then the whole bumper pulls off back. And just like the oil filter housing cap, they are 13 millimeters. This is the other brake duct. I don't really need that. The trick to pulling off the bumpers is to pull straight back and sort of brace it with your knees so you don't drop it on the floor. But other than that, it's not that hard. There we go, bumpers off. Now we can start mounting the cooler. Alright, so I got a table set up right back there. I'm going to take the bumper, flip it upside down so it's sitting basically upside down, pull the rest of that scrape guard off, and then we're going to start installing the cooler on the bumper guard. So basically the cooler is going to sit kind of like that in there. So we're going to have to drill some holes up top there. It's easier to go from the bottom because we don't really have to worry about hitting this upper guard here with the drill. And then we'll run the lines on and then put the bumper back on. Right about there is where I want the cooler to sit. That would look pretty good to me. Looks about right. It'll look something like that. That's kind of weird to do. Hold it upside down like that. So we're going to do some marks through these two holes, and then I'm going to drill through this metal here. And then we're going to use some basic nuts and bolts hardware to bolt it all in and hold it in place. So right about there, and right about there. So as for choosing your drill bit size, these again is the mounting hardware I'm going to use. So I'm choosing a drill bit size that is a little bit larger in diameter than the hardware I'm going to use to mount it. So the hole will be fine. When I throw a washer on there, it's not going to fall through the hole. So I'm using a 1/4 inch drill bit. But first I'm going to be using a much smaller drill bit to start the hole, make a guide for the bigger drill bit. There's one. And there's the second. Alright, so we got our mounting hardware all set up. We got 2 bolts, 2 nuts, and 4 washers. Alright, so bolt, washer, through the hole, through the cooler, washer, nut. Excellent. Now I'm going to do the other side, and then we'll start tightening them down. There we go. All nice and tightened down. So some of you may ask, shouldn't you bolt it down at 4 places instead of 2? I guess you could, but the angle at which the drill kind of gets into when you're trying to drill those holes is kind of a pain. Not to mention, it doesn't really move, and it's a pretty light cooler, and it doesn't have a lot of stress on that certain area of the car, so I'm not necessarily worried about it falling off. It's on pretty tight, and I can almost pick the bumper up by the cooler itself. I'm not worried about it falling off or coming out or anything like that. So I think those 2 bolts, if you tighten them up pretty good, it'll be fine. From here we're going to put the cooling lines on the cooler, get it all tightened down, and then I'm going to put the skid plate back on, and then we'll put the bumper back on the car. Now, putting the lines on the cooler before you throw it onto the car is the way to do it. I found that from several trial and error on the drop top. Simply because you can actually tighten these down a lot easier and get them on right now, as opposed to later on. I had the bumper already on the car with the cooler on it, and the cooler was back on and the lines were on the filter housing cap, and I realized I couldn't really get to them to tighten them down. I had to take it all apart again, take the bumper off, take the lines off the filter housing cap, just to install them on the cooler. So this is the way to do it. Now get them tight, but don't kill the fittings. Just get them nice and tight. Alright, it's done. It looks killer. Time to put the skid plate back on and then the bumper back on the car. Okay, so now we got to put the bumper back on, and putting the bumper on is a little bit of a trick. So not only do you have to line up the bumper on these 2 sections right here to get the bolt holes to line up, you also have to get this rail section to hook up on the inside of this guy. So those 2 little slits go right in here, and it has it on this side and that side of the bumper. So it's kind of a trick to get it on. It might take a few minutes, it takes me a little bit to get it on, but once it's on, just pull it down, good to go. You can definitely see it from the front of the car, and that's exactly what I wanted. Alright. So the bumper is now completely back on. I have to run those feed lines back through the bumper up into the filter housing, and then at that point we're going to bolt it back up, tighten those guys down. I'm going to drain the oil, put the filter in, fill it back up, and we'll call it. There we go. Nice and tight. So the oil cooler is installed, almost done, but we're not finished yet. So I'm going to drain the oil, put the wheels back on the car, and then we'll put oil on the car, and then we'll be done. If you're changing your oil, don't forget the drain plug washer, or else that shit'll leak. Now we got to drop in the filter, fill it up with oil, and I got to put the airbox on. I got to deal with that, that'll be fun. So as far as oil filter setups for these caps, the manufacturer of the cap that you got should have the information you need. So I would contact them or look it up. If you manage to score one of these caps, either the black one or the silver one, the filter has this little ring on the bottom there. That guy goes down and then the cap goes on over it. Try and get it seated as best you can before you tighten it down. And this guy gets 216 inch-pounds or 18 foot-pounds. Now as far as oil goes, I use Castrol Edge 5W30 full synthetic. One thing to keep in mind though is with an oil cooler on this car and the drop top, I always run a quart over max. And the reason for that is you are now adding space in the oil system. Because you're adding oil in the lines and in the cooler, there's more oil running to the cooler and through the cooler than there usually is, because there's usually no cooler, right? So you have to account for the oil being in that area, being in the cooler and in the lines, and accommodate that oil for being in the rest of the engine. So because there's more space, I always run a quart over max, basically. I'll run 8, 8.5, maybe 9 quarts. I'll usually check the dipstick, and when it says it's at high, I'll add another quart. The last thing you want to do is not add enough oil into the oil system while running an oil cooler, or running the normal amount and then be running low. Even if you're running the normal amount of oil, it'll still be kind of low because you have more space in the oil system now, if that makes any sense. So if you're adding an oil cooler to your car, just run a quart high. The dipstick is reading just over max. Probably I'd say like close to a quart over max, which is where we want to be, account for the extra oil in the cooler. I'm going to take it for a drive, after I put the intake back on, and then we'll check the oil again to see what it's at, and I'll add oil if I have to. Alright, so the cooler's on, it's filled up with oil, the filter's in, we're all good to go. Except I need to put the air intake back on, and that's going to be the fun part. Because it's a big ass air box, and the cooling lines run right in the space where the air box goes. And these don't have a lot of flex to them. Yeah, that's not happening. So I'm going to put my cold air intake on. I don't know if I'm complaining about that or not, but it is what it is. There we go. Got the intake on. Everything is good to go. We are done. Damn, does that look nice. So as I drive it, the lines will sort of adjust and I guess more set in place where they will be. When I first had this oil cooler on, the lines like sort of looped out a lot more and they kind of hang a little bit more, but as I drove they sort of settled in back in, and so that's what these lines should do. So it looks a little bit different than it will in a couple days after I'm done driving it. That's it, the oil cooler is installed, and now you guys know how I do this beautiful little mod right here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, happy modding, and I will see you guys later.
You should take it slow.
Of the cap should have all the fucking beautiful